everyone. I think we might begin. If more people will come, we'll let them in as they come in. So hello, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm just doing the introduction, and then I'll pass over to our guests, who will the bulk of the hour you'll be hearing from them. But it gives me great pleasure to do this introduction because this is a joint event between March of the Living and the Council of Christians and Jews, and I'm involved in both. So what better person, I guess, than for me to introduce. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to both audiences, March of the Living, Council of Christians and Jews. I want to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Bunurong people in Melbourne, in the Kulin Nation, and that everyone who's joining us is probably on different lands. Just amongst our speakers, I know that one's in Adelaide, one's in country New South Wales, and one's in New Zealand. And some of the audience, I'm sure, is as further afield, potentially even than that. So thank you, everyone, again for being here and for joining us. We do events, both the Council of Christians and Jews and March of the Living do regular events, both online and in person. And so this is a great opportunity for us to do a combined event on a topic that I think will be interesting to everyone, a fraction too much Holocaust fiction. Ron and our guests will explain what that means and where that topic comes from. But let me begin, as I said, just by introducing Ron, who was active as a writer and actor in Adelaide from 1978 to 1984, performing in more than 30 plays and writing or co-writing 4 theatre pieces. He later became a lecturer in journalism at the University of South Australia. Since retiring in 2021, he has resumed his involvement in theatre and freelance journalism. He is currently writing a play about the Hungarian man who saved his mother's life during the Holocaust. He has also had a long involvement with Christian-Jewish dialogue and is currently the chair of the Australian Council of Christians and Jews, which is the parent and umbrella organisation of the Council of Christians and Jews Victoria, of which I'm chair. So I think with that, I'm going to pass on to Ron. Ron will introduce our guests, and then we'll take it from there. So over to you, Ron, and everyone. By the way, just before, if anyone has any questions during, please use the chat function. We'll get to the questions at the end. So please use the chat function if you have any questions or ideas during, so that we don't interrupt our speakers. And also keep in mind that both organizations are not-for-profit organizations. So if you like this, even if you don't, we'd very much appreciate a donation if that's your way of participating in this. In the meantime, let me pass it on to Ron, and he'll take you through the rest of the afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alex. It's lovely to be here. This event has been cooking for some time. I recognise that I'm hosting this event from the country of the Ghana people, and recognise the traditional owners of the countries where you all live and work today, and the First Nations people present in the webinar and meeting. I pay my respect to all elders, past and present, and celebrate the diversity of Indigenous people and their cultures and connections to the lands and waters we currently live in. It gives me great pleasure to introduce first Kim Kelly and then Navina Clemerson. Kim is an author of 12 novels. Her work has been shortlisted and longlisted for several literary awards, including the ARA Historical Novel Prize and the Nilma Sydney Short Story Prize. She's also a well-known book editor, working for Australia's major publishing houses. She holds a Master of Creative Writing from Macquarie University, for which she was awarded the Fred Rush Convocation Prize for Writing, and she's currently engaged in graduate research focusing on representation of Jewish people and experiences in Australian historical fiction. Originally from Sydney, she now lives in Millithorpe in central west New South Wales on Wiradjuri country. And from New Zealand, we have Navina Clemerson, and do this sharing. There we go. Hang on. Her latest book is based on her family's. Hang on, I've got this. Can you see that?
No.
That's no.
It worked just a minute ago.
Got it before?
Never mind, Ron. I have a copy here that
Okay.
I can show.
You can show it.
Yeah.
All right. So Navina's latest book is based on her family's experience in post-war Germany and as refugees in the United Kingdom. There Was a Garden in Nuremberg is available on Amazon. She's also published a translation of a memoir by Bernhard Kolb, The Jews of Nuremberg, 1845 to 1939. Navina was born in London to refugee parents. She spent much of her childhood in France. She holds degrees in biology and psychology. After some years in Israel, the Netherlands, and Italy, she settled with her family in Wellington, New Zealand, where she enjoys an unruly garden. So a little background, Kim and I have been discussing the representation of Jews in fiction, but basically by email and messaging for some time. We both read Dara Horn, who talks about loving dead Jews. And the book was called People Love Dead Jews. And the implication is they love dead Jews, but they're not so much interested in live ones. And part of that was the representation of Jews in fiction. So Kim wrote a celebrated blog piece about the lack of respect for Jewish experience in romantic fictions that use the Holocaust as a background. And that was awarded its own prize as the best post of 2019. So we've been talking since at least 2019, I think more. And can you tell the story of the blog post, Kim? What led you to write it? Can you unmute yourself?
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we're all familiar with the novel The Tattooist of Auschwitz. It was published in 2018, and to the publisher's great surprise, I'm sure, it became an international bestseller. And as a result of that, came under the scrutiny of the Auschwitz Museum, who wrote a very critical piece on that novel, pretty much tearing apart the novel at a research level, which was, all good and well. It is a romance and what have you. But what really shocked me and what sent me down the road of writing that blog post was the response of the publisher and particularly the author, Heather Morris, who kind of, shrugged their shoulders and said, well, it's fiction. And that's all very well on the one hand, but on the other hand, don't we have a responsibility as writers of fiction to honour those people who actually lived the experiences that we're writing about?
So you felt she wasn't honouring that experience?
Not to the depths that she could have. So, there's a note in the back of the book thanking her researchers and what have you. But if you put that side by side with the report from the Auschwitz Museum, the research starts to look very scanty. And, subsequent to that, me doing, a lot more research, there was a lot more that, Heather Morris might have explored in the story. I mean, would I have written that blog post had that small romance not become so big? Probably not.
So on the one hand, you're concerned that one of your concerns is that writers are only using the Holocaust as a kind of exotic background to an ordinary love story, a romantic fiction.
Yes, and I wouldn't argue necessarily that Heather Morris has done that because, of course, she's based the novel on very extensive interviews with a specific Holocaust survivor, Lali Sokolov. So her story certainly doesn't fall into that category. But I think the success of the tattooist of Auschwitz has certainly spawned a lot of Holocaust romances just in the last few years that, yes, some of them can use the Holocaust as an exotic background. And then that kind of swings back round to Dara Horn's idea that we only like dead Jews. We don't like Jews who act like Jews. We don't like Jews who, have, cultural experiences or religious experiences. The Jewish people in these particular romances tend to be very reduced figures where the word Jew signifies a whole bunch of things and we don't get to know them as Jewish people.
So Navina, you're concerned because you're writing a story which is based on your family story, but you don't have all the facts. And so you need to provide some fictional connections. And therefore you call your work faction, and you've changed the names, etc., of the characters. I've got a similar problem because I'm writing about my mother's background and the connections aren't there. And I don't even know whether to call her by her real name or not. But Navina, you've decided not to. And why is that? Can you unmute yourself?
To say thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I really appreciate this opportunity. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello from New Zealand to everybody. I started off writing a memoir, and then I realized that there were gaps, and I did my best to fill those gaps, and I did so with a great deal of awareness. Because I really didn't want to get things wrong. I had read books that didn't respect the reality of the Holocaust, and I found it very distressing. I have family members who disappeared on both sides of my family, and I wanted to respect the history. So excuse me?
It's all right.
Okay. So I did a lot of research. I was in Nuremberg, and I went to the archive, and I was given by the archivist there various materials that I used. I translated somebody's memoir from German, and I also was able to read a book about my main villain, a man called Benno Martin, and I used that in the book. So I had a lot of background also from my grandparents, whom I knew, and also from living in France near the German border. So the sort of German culture was very familiar to me. So the novel, so it worked very well, and I have a sort of storytelling instinct, and I found it very pleasurable to fill in these gaps in ways which I thought were likely and probable. The novel worked in my favor also from another point of view, because you know what families are like. Not everybody agrees on the way things were. And so by making it a novel and changing the names, I got a bit of distance between my family and the actual story that I wrote. And it was also possible to give a more honest portrayal of what people were like, warts and all. And of course, people are still offended, but less.
So you're both looking at ethical choices in the depiction of suffering and the accuracy of detail in daily life. Is that right?
Yes.
So why do novels and plays about the Holocaust need to have that extra level of historic accuracy?
Well, to be honest, Ron, I think that any historical novel needs to be accurate and respect what happened. And the point with the Holocaust is that it's so monstrous and so hard to believe and so hard to understand that it is helpful for the reader if they can have confidence that the writer has has taken due care and researched the topic well.
Tim, what do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely agree. The thing that distinguishes Navina's novel so much from so many of the other Holocaust novels, that these kind of romantic novels that are published, is the level of cultural detail that she includes in it. And now, when we're thinking about the way that we write the other, the way that we write, minority groups or marginalised groups, when we include details in our stories, those deep cultural details, readers feel that they're getting to know that person, they're getting some sort of insight into the other. And it's really expected, if you're going to write, I mean, certainly in Australian publishing, if you're going to write a story with First Nations characters or any person of colour, you are expected to do your homework and do it very well and not get things wrong. But I think one of the problems that we have when we're writing Jewish characters is that there's not that same level of expectation and scrutiny, which kind of cycles back to the idea of the monstrousness of the Holocaust itself, because it's such a huge event, such a huge trauma. We think we know what it is. I mean, the general, reading community we think we know what Jewish people have experienced. We think we know who Jewish people are. So lots of shortcuts are taken that are somehow acceptable in Holocaust novels that would not be acceptable in other kinds of novels, I think.
So do you think that there's insufficient awareness about Jewish cultural practices and traditions, and that means that the portrayal of these people is very thin and
Generally, yes.
So you just pick a signifier and say they're Jewish, but apart from that, you don't know anything much about them.
Exactly. So, for example, in The Tattooist of Auschwitz, there are no references at all to holy days. There are no references at all to different kinds of Jews. There's no reference even to Yiddish and the different languages that the Jewish people spoke. There is one reference to prayer, but it's a very generic reference to, like, those people over there were praying, and that's it. And I just don't think that kind of scant or overlooking of cultural detail would be acceptable when we're writing about any kind of other minority or marginalised group.
So you think Jews suffer because they are people think that they're more aware of what the Jews are like.
Yeah, and we've seen so many shows.
Go on.
Sorry. We've seen.
They think the Jews are like the Jews they see in Jewish novels from American Jewish novels or something like that, or they're just signifiers. They're just empty signifiers. Navina, did you have that idea as well, or what was driving you in writing your story about your family?
Oh, well, first of all, because I grew up with all these stories, and I became the family historian. I was the person most interested, and so all these stories came to me. And then coming to live in New Zealand from Europe, I became gradually aware how very little people knew about Jews and about the Holocaust. And also there was never, it's difficult to start talking about the Holocaust when it's not the right setting, over a cup of coffee or when one needs the right approach. And so I was able to write this as a result. Yeah.
And you had a good background in Judaism yourself, so you knew what you were writing about.
Yes, I've lived in Israel, and I'm a member of the temple here as well. Yeah.
do you think creative people have to take into account the ethics of what they're doing in these depictions, and how do they, what do they actually need to do that?
Is that to me?
Yeah, both of you. We'll let Navina answer first, and then Kim, you can come back.
Well, I think it's very important because it is so damaging when a facile representation of the Holocaust takes place. And I remember one person saying to me, "Oh, well, my parents also suffered." She was Scottish. "My parents also suffered during the war. They had to go into an Anderson shelter in the bottom of the garden. That was very uncomfortable for them." So that was her equivalent, because she knew nothing. She's since read my book. It's a different opinion now. Yeah.
Kim, what do you think?
I think I absolutely agree with Navina. In the publishing setting and in the way that writers, as a community, talk about things and issues, this is a conversation that we're really yet to have. It's a conversation that started, of course, and necessarily and positively about the way we write about other people. And I think that the next step is to start talking more seriously about the way that we write Jews. There's that bind that I'm sure most people are familiar with, that on the one hand, the Holocaust is this monstrous thing that's ineffable. It's very difficult to describe. It's very difficult to get across. But at the same time, it needs to be remembered. How do you strike that balance and not exploit it in any way? That sort of famous Adorno quote that there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. How do we deal with that? It's a conversation that is there to be had, but we're not having it yet. And I think that that's where the ethics happens in the conversation. It's not a, either or. It's not a, do this and do that. It's not a set of prescriptive rules or protocols necessarily, but a depth of consideration for the people that we're writing about.
Are you most concerned about the exploitation of the Holocaust by writers who have little or no connection with it, or is that your major feeling about this romantic fiction stuff? Or
my major concern is really in the more insidious veins of anti-Semitic tropes, old, myths about Jewish people that creep into everything from The Tattooist of Auschwitz to literary novels like Christos Scholkes' Dead Europe. They're the things we need to identify and have those conversations about, because those kinds of stereotypes are so ingrained that I'm sure some people even think they're kind of true. That I think is of more concern.
Can you give a bit of an example from Christos Scholkes, for example?
Yeah, well, one that is common to both The Tattooist of Auschwitz and Christos Scholkes' Dead Europe is the idea of the Jew who is clever with money and gems and, doing the deal. That trope is in both of those novels, and it's unchallenged. So you would expect it to be unchallenged in a romance novel, but you would expect it to be challenged in a literary novel. Now, Christos Scholkes has said that, this novel that he's written is an exploration of anti-Semitism to show, the evil of it. But unfortunately, the way that he's written it, without any kind of guardrails, without any challenge to the tropes inside the novel, it can, in a less sophisticated reader, just prop up those tropes. So,
Navina, in your novel, the family is represented, they're wealthy and middle class. And were you worried about how an audience would receive these people?
Not particularly, but I was careful I have to admit, I was careful. There is one stage where someone bribes a clerk. It's a life and death situation, and a clerk is bribed in order to obtain a permission.
Yes.
And I decided that bribing may have happened more often, but I was careful only to put it once because I didn't want the image to come across of people who bribe as a habit. These were such extraordinary circumstances that everybody did anything they could to get out. And so they used that method, but I will admit that I put it once, but not more often, because I know that there is this tendency to attribute that sort of behavior, unethical behavior, to Jews. And I thought, I can't expect people to understand everything.
I have to admit,
I was protective.
I have to admit personally that I'm pleased that I can represent my mother's family as very poor, because they were. And so I don't feel as if I'm contributing to those stereotypes, but there's other stereotypes, I guess, and it's I don't know that the creator of the fiction or the creator of the play has a responsibility to disabuse people of their stereotypes. I don't know. So it's a question that sits above The Merchant of Venice, for example. It's a play in which the characters are anti-Semitic, but is it an anti-Semitic play? And we can ask about Fagin in Great Expectations.
Oliver Twist.
Oliver Twist, sorry. So what do you think, Kim? And what do you think, Phil? And later, Navina, you can respond.
Well, we can kind of forgive Shakespeare a little bit because he probably didn't know many Jews. He was probably only using the tropes that he had from the mythology about Jews, because, of course, at the time that Shakespeare was writing, Jews were still expelled from England. So it's probably unlikely that he had much interaction with them. Whereas I don't think we can forgive Dickens so much at various levels. He was pulled up about his portrayal of Fagin by a Jewish acquaintance and actually shown why it was wrong. And he revised that novel, I think, about half a dozen times. And I think, as you and I have spoken about before, Ron, that it would not have taken him much in those revisions to slip in a paragraph here or there about the origins of Fagin, to show the effects of, the pogroms in Europe that forced people to cram into the East End of London and forced them into lives of crime because they didn't have many opportunities for anything else, like a lot of other people. It wouldn't have taken Dickens very much to slip in that piece of information, and he chose not to. And I question that. Again, it's no, sort of right or wrong. It's a conversation to be had. Why did he think it was acceptable to leave Fagin with there's no sympathy for him. There's no sympathy for his position. And Dickens is so famous for bringing us into sympathy with people who have fallen on hard times. So why didn't Dickens do that?
Navina?
Can I add? Yes, I think that if you have a villain, and a villain with all these awful characteristics, there has to be a good reason why you choose to make him a Jew. He can be a villain if he's a villain who stands perfectly well as a valid villain without being Jewish. He doesn't need to be Jewish as well. So leave us alone. Yeah.
Somebody's asked me, do you think any non-Jew, no matter how well informed, has the right to create a story about the Holocaust? And it raises the issue about the boy in the striped pajamas in a way, because, okay, so question, do you think non-Jews have the right to write about Jews and the Holocaust?
Can I answer that?
Navina?
I it's cultural appropriation to some extent. And I was careful to put my Hebrew name on the book so that people would know that I am Jewish and that I'm writing about my own people.
So do you think Jews own the Holocaust?
No, definitely not. And I think that good books can be written by non-Jews. But I think a great deal of care needs to be exercised, and a very good reason why they choose. I would like to know why they choose that.
So this person is saying,
well, Kim is a very good example.
Rage on behalf of Jews, particularly survivors. When I read a work of fiction, whether it's allegedly based on fact, like The Tattoos of Auschwitz, or lessons to be learned, like The Boy in the Striped, I cannot accept such books. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas she's referring to. Kim, what's your position on non-Jews writing books about the Holocaust? And maybe we can go and talk about The Boy in the Striped Pajamas.
Well, I think the reality is, given the absolute explosion of Holocaust romances in particular over the last 4 or 5 years, you're not going to stop non-Jews from writing these stories. They're going to do it anyway. And yes, there is an exploitative element to it. I don't necessarily blame the authors for that. The publishers bear some responsibility for that too, because they see it as a trend. They're even more removed from the humanity of the problem. But I think it comes back to having these discussions. I think we've seen quite a profound shift in the way Australian writers write First Nations characters, the way that they consult, the way that they are very careful culturally, and it's very frowned upon not to do those things now. And I think we need to have that same kind of care and those same kind of conversations happening when we're writing Jewish characters.
So it's interesting because historically the representation of First Nations people has been very stereotypical, and it's only recently that that's changed. And I'm sure that's the case with representation of Asian people living in Australia. And so Jews aren't seen as, so are Jews seen as other, or are they seen as just like us, but white with a bit of historical background?
Is that to me?
That's you.
Well, it goes to that. For anybody who's read David Baddiel's wonderful polemical essay, he describes it absolutely perfectly, that Jews actually do fall between those two categories. On the one hand, white, and, what have you got to complain about? You're privileged people and white and what have you. And on the other, when it suits, you're not quite like us. And those sorts of stereotypes of, that they creep into conversations all the time. I'm not telling anybody here anything you don't know. That idea that Jews are all wealthy and Jews stick together and all that sort of thing. So there is that duality, and it is a problem.
Navina, what would you like to say?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Oh, Navina, what would you like to say on that issue? Is there in your reading of other novels about the Holocaust, or other works about the Holocaust by non-Jews, do you think that there's not sufficient research or understanding of the characters?
In preparation for, I don't tend to read books about the Holocaust by non-Jews.
Right.
That's one.
Right.
And so in preparation for this discussion, I tried to read, excuse me.
Sorry, is that a blindness in us, or is it? You're making a choice. You're saying, I don't.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'm not interested.
Not interested.
I'm not interested. No. No. Yes. I try not to read too much about the Holocaust anyway, because it is It is oppressive. It saddens me so much, and it doesn't do me any good. It just makes me depressed. So and fearful, which is also not good.
So I don't know. So Kim, we've discussed this issue about the boy in the striped pajamas, and John Boyne says it's a fable. It's not history.
I've never read that book.
Okay.
I've never read that. I'm sorry, I've never read that book, and I only read a couple of books in preparation for this chat, but that one was not one of them. I'm sorry.
So what do you
Maybe
think?
Kim can say something.
Yeah, Kim, what do you think about that idea that it's a fact that you can treat the Holocaust as something from which you draw a fable rather than historic fact?
I think there's an element of arrogance there that I certainly feel uncomfortable with. The same way that I feel uncomfortable with Heather Morris's arrogance in saying, oh, it's 95% fact, and, you know, sort of riding roughshod over the truth and the facts. It's difficult, isn't it? These novels are extraordinarily popular, ridiculously, you know, commercially successful. The big novels from Schindler's Ark, Boy in the Striped Pajamas, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, they've all been written by non-Jews. We should be uncomfortable about that idea. We should be like, why? What is going on here that these novels by these types of authors have been so successful and have spawned lots and lots and lots of other commercial successes as well? Again, it comes back to that idea. It's a conversation we're not having. I'm uncomfortable about it. Who do I speak to about it?
So
I tried with my little blog post, but it's, you know.
Alex has said that Vic Alhadeff asked about the boy in the striped pajamas and says, is there an argument that it makes people aware of the Holocaust who might not be aware of the Holocaust in any case, and therefore it's relatively good or valid or something? Kim,
the idea that the important idea of awareness of the Holocaust, absolutely. And so stacking up all the, you know, sort of commercial success against the millions and millions of people that have become aware of the Holocaust as a result of these books. But if you look at the scholarship around this idea, yes, on the one hand, it's wonderful that fiction can be used as an educative tool in that way. But if the fiction is not giving realistic portrayals and faithfully factual portrayals, is there an ethical problem there as well?
So we have a problem with the ethics of claiming that something is true when it's not true. We have a problem with the ethics of turning a truthful event into a fable, even though it may. Are we constructing a world of where nobody can write about this at all? Kim, what do you think? And Navina?
I don't think it's possible for non-Jews to not write about the Holocaust. I just don't think that is going to happen in this universe. It's just not going to happen. But we need to be having these kinds of conversations that we're having right now. This is the next level of awareness. It's okay to go and read the book, you know, or go and see the film and what have you. But where's the conversation afterwards, and the challenging conversation, the ethical conversation?
So we're talking about two different things: the need for survivors and the families of survivors to tell stories, and I guess there's the need for the rest of the community to be aware of the Holocaust in the hope that we don't repeat it, though we do easily. and then there's the profit motives of the publishers and do you think the publishers are at all aware of having an ethical role in this conversation?
No, I don't think it comes into the equation. These are corporate business people. To be brutal about it, they might as well be selling toothbrushes sometimes. The only time that ethics becomes an issue for publishers really is when it blows up on Twitter, is when they get egg on their face and when they lose cachet or lose sales as a result of something. But that is not looking like it's going to happen in this case at the moment.
So, Navina, your publisher is Amsterdam Press, which is devoted to Holocaust survivor literature. Is that right?
Yes, that's true.
Did you consider going to another publisher, perhaps a larger one?
I'm afraid that I was so happy that somebody was willing to publish my book that yes. I took the opportunity with a very happy heart, especially as I was in company of many other writers about the Holocaust, though I was aware that not all the books were of top quality. And but beggars can't be choosers, and this was my opportunity, so I took it. Yes.
So on the other hand, the issues have been raised about the representation of the Holocaust in historical events, which, for example, there was one monograph by Anna Haikova which talks about a queer relationship between people in the camps, but the children of the people who were referred to were upset about it, even though it's absolutely a truthful representation of what was happening. Is the sensitivity of survivors to having their families represented in the most positive light a problem for writers?
Navina?
Well, I mean, I think that every case, take it case by case, every author is different, every story is different, the repercussions are different, and the toughness of people varies as well, and their ability to accept difference. So if these people were homophobic, I mean, surely whether they were survivors or not, this was an issue for them, and maybe not an issue that the author needed to, depending on how the author felt about that particular point of view. Yeah.
Kim, have you got a view on that?
I think that it's a little bit different with books than it can be with other media. With a book, you tend to know from the blurb and other material what the book is about. If you don't like the content of that particular book, just like Navina said, she doesn't like to read Holocaust literature. You don't have to read it. And if you pick up a book and a chapter takes you into a place you don't want to go, you can close the book and you don't have to keep viewing it. I think we do have a problem with survivors and children and grandchildren of survivors when they're kind of hit over the head with material, be it in a film or photographs that they're not expecting to see. And that can re-traumatize people and knock people for six. And so I think there is a very strong case with visual imagery, ads on TV and things like that we should avoid throwing things like that at people, the same way that we put warnings on shows that have First Nations people who've passed away. We should be that sensitive about this massive traumatic event. But with a book, I think it'd be very difficult to start putting warning labels on books, and it would be very difficult to start, very difficult for publishers, but difficult for authors too, to start changing books or not publishing books because somebody didn't like something that was in it, or somebody had a slightly different point of view. As Navina mentioned earlier, no two family members have the same understanding of the history of a particular event that happened. Everybody's got a different point of view. So I think it could be, an absolute mess, and nobody would write anything if we had to take every opinion into consideration. So, yeah, it's a bit of a tough one with books, but that is a conversation that comes up in publishing every now and again. Should books have warning labels on them?
The final question that I've got is, do survivors and their children have a right to be harmed by right not to be harmed by too much reality, or what would be a more ethical way to deal with that? And we talk about warning labels on books, perhaps. I don't know. I think
that they've been through things that are so difficult that the survivors I've known in my life, who have been survivors from camps, I'm talking about. I'm not talking about just somebody who survived Second World War, but people who were in concentration camps. They were pretty tough cookies.
That's right.
And it didn't allow...
You had to be to get through it.
That's right. And they didn't...
I mean, they had to do things that nobody would want to do, and they had to survive.
Exactly.
And that reality...
that was the reality. They would say, well, that's what the world is like.
Okay.
They wouldn't like it.
Thank you very much, both of you. Alex, do you want to get to some questions, or are there any?
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of questions, and I'm sure this conversation has raised a lot of issues for many people, and a lot of comments and questions. But let's go back to the top, and then we'll see how many we can get through. So the first question was to Kim, which says, not all Jews kept Jewish holidays and rituals during the Holocaust. Why does it need to be mentioned, and why is that relevant?
Oh, it's not relevant at all. It's just the absence is glaring. That's all. The absence of language, the absence of culture. It's not that something has to be mentioned. It's that in that particular book and so many books that follow afterwards, it's a glaring absence. Okay.
The next question or comment comes from Emmanuel, who I believe works at a university. And he said, my institution nominated a fiction book, This Is My Song, by Richard Yaxley, as required reading for first-year undergraduates. I'm curious whether this book is by an Australian author who's, I think, not Jewish, falls under good Holocaust fiction, or utilizes the Holocaust merely to drive the narrative.
I don't know the book. Do you?
Don't know the book.
No.
Look it up.
Okay. I guess we can't answer that if no one knows what the book is.
Who is the author?
Emmanuel, are you on? Do you want to unmute yourself and explain a little bit about the book?
Sorry, it's I've got family around, but yes, it was a book nominated by the university, and I think it's an intergenerational narrative that goes back to a concentration camp. And is about a Jewish family, but the author writing it was not Jewish. So Richard Yaxley, This Is My Song, but I don't know too much beyond that myself. I think the question's more or less been answered, whether non-Jews should be the ones writing about Holocaust experiences. So, I'm happy to just leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay. Janine had a second question. Her first one, I think, was answered, but her second question is, do you believe that so many of the fables written to educate the public about the Holocaust actually mislead in the most appalling way?
She says...
Actually, I'm sorry. I didn't... Whether they actually what in the most appalling way?
Mislead.
Oh, mislead. Oh.
Well, certainly the boy in the striped pajamas misleads.
Her example then goes on to say that in that book in particular, many of my friends feel grateful to know that the Nazi officer who lost his son suddenly understood how it feels. Like in the movie also, Life is Beautiful, it so diminishes the horror and leaves people thinking that all in all, the Holocaust wasn't necessarily so bad.
Exactly. Well, Life is Beautiful was a complete aberration as far as I was concerned. The film Life is Beautiful. Yeah.
Dara Horn makes that point very strongly, that in many of these narratives written by non-Jews, there is this need for redemption. There's the need for the happy ending, and that is when you look at the reality, is appalling.
He also talks about the myth of, well, not the myth, but the importance of having a non-Jew who intervenes, like Schindler in Schindler's List, and which in a way diminishes the role of the Jews in their survival. On the other hand, you know, the reality is that sometimes non-Jews did help out, and so it's not just a trope, but it's also a reality. But if you only focus on that, then it's a way of making the non-Jewish reader feel better about it rather than...
And creates a false perception. I think Dara Horn has some great statistics in her book too, just about, you know, about just how many righteous Gentiles there were out of all of the millions, and there weren't many.
I was very shocked with the one book which was about the Warsaw Ghetto. This was one of the books that I read in preparation for this chat, and the two heroes in the Warsaw Ghetto, where everybody was struggling to survive, the two heroes were both Catholic, and I found that it was as if the author couldn't quite bring him or herself, I can't remember, to attribute to Jews the kindness, the courage, the compassion that he foisted upon these two heroes. And I couldn't finish the book. I put it to one side. It just made me feel ill, so I left it. Yeah.
Kim, at the beginning, you said that the Holocaust doesn't have the same expectation, or this kind of writing doesn't have the same expectation as other forms of literature. Where do you think that expectation comes from, and why does this kind of literature not have the same expectation?
Oh, I think it comes back to, well, two ideas, really. One is the Holocaust is so enormous, it's hard to get our head around. But it also comes back to that idea too of Jews being people we think we know on the one hand, and we put them in the box of white and privileged when it suits the mainstream, and then we put them in the box of the other when it suits us too. And I don't think there's any other group of people who the mainstream treats that way. So I think it is an exceptional case on those two levels.
We have one more question. Yeah, we have one more question from Vic, and then I'll pass on to Cedric, who I think has his own few questions, and we'll close the meeting as well. But the first question from Vic is, given what you said about not accepting non-Jewish writers for Holocaust writing, the question is, surely we're not putting Schindler's Ark and the Boy in Striped Pajamas in the same category?
Indeed. One shouldn't, I don't think.
No, we shouldn't.
I mean, they're all the survivors who can testify.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is a difference, even though both were written by non-Jews.
I suppose the difference is that Schindler, Thomas Keneally spoke to a whole lot of survivors.
Right.
And it got a survivor's perspective on Schindler.
Right. Okay, so let's pass on to Cedric. I believe you've got a few questions as well. One connects back to Schindler, and then unless anyone has any others, I'll let Cedric close the meeting as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for that. It was a fascinating discussion. Needless to say, the ethics and the ethical questions that something like the Holocaust raises are endless. And this is only one aspect of the ethical questions, and they go so deep that certainly we couldn't give justice to many of them in a lifetime, never mind in a matter of an hour's discussion. So I think raising the questions is probably the most important aspect here, because the answers are definitely not straightforward, and they are so interlinked and so complex. But on the other hand, being able to voice these opinions and hear opinions around things like that, as Kim and Navina and Ron alluded to, that the discussion shouldn't just end when a book is written or when a movie becomes a major hit. The discussion thereafter needs to continue, because at the end of the day, doing justice, and I use justice in a very, very light form here, doing justice to the topic and being respectful about memory and being true to what actually occurred, so that we can actually learn from this, so that we won't repeat these kinds of horrors, is ultimately what it's all about. And so I won't ask further questions, because we could carry on ad infinitum. I just wanted to thank all three of you on behalf of March of the Living. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. And I would like to just end by mentioning that in 2 weeks' time, we will be holding another March of the Living event, which is going to be fascinating, I believe, as well. And that is a personal story about descendants and the family history of someone from Lublin. This is a personal friend and contact of both Alex and myself. She's a guide, and her family comes from Lublin, and it'll be an obvious, a wonderful opportunity to hear all about her family's experience there. I just want to wish everybody well, and to thank you all for coming. And kia ora, Navina, thank you.
Yeah.
And have a good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.